Welcome to Divcasts from University of Chicago Divinity School. For more of our podcasts and information about our terms of use, please see our website, divinity.uchicago.edu/podcasts.
Professor Rosengarten will talk to us about George Herbert.
Okay, thanks. I think the first thing I want to do is read the poem and then say a couple of things about it and ask some questions. But I want to say first that I've never taught this poem. And so this is a new experience for me. And for those of you who know me, I don't usually teach poetry. So there are some reasons for that, which I'll get into. So, Love 3 by George Herbert. Love bade me welcome, yet my soul drew back, guilty of dust and sin. The quick-eyed love, observing me grow slack from my first entrance in, drew nearer to me, sweetly questioning if I lacked anything. A guest, I answered, worthy to be here. Love said, you shall be he. I, the unkind, the ungrateful, oh my dear, I cannot look on thee. Love took my hand and smiling did reply, who made the eyes but I? Truth, Lord, but I have marred them, let my shame go where it doth deserve. And know you not, says love, who bore the blame? My dear, then I will serve. You must sit down, says love, and taste my meat. So I did sit and eat. Now, the first time I read this poem, I was a sophomore in college, and whether it was raging testosterone or having just read Freud, I couldn't believe this was written in 1630. I just want to say that right at the start. I'll talk a little more about that in a minute. But it was. George Herbert was, as some of you will know, a 17th century Englishman who lived for only 40 years, from 1593 to 1633. So he lives through a period of tumult in England. And the poems are written, as best we can tell, in the 1620s, in a period of time when he makes a transfer in his life from the attempt to become a political leader in Parliament to becoming a parson with a country parsonage, where he creates a kind of small-scale commonwealth. So he's an inheritor of the Elizabethan paradigm for Christianity in England, which is to say that the Commonwealth is a macrocosm of local communities. And through the Book of Common Prayer and the Bible and whatnot, he lives his last years creating such a community. He also spends those years writing a series of 164 poems, which he titles The Temple, which are a kind of memory palace of Christianity, which include, and I want to, this poem doesn't dramatize it quite so much, but I want to insist this is a visual as well as a verbal artifact, because many of the poems are structured in the poems. For instance, there's a poem on Easter that's in the form of wings. There's a poem about the altar that is shaped like an altar. And so the book leads you through a series of versifications that are meant to create emblems of parts of the temple. And we get this complicated mix of microcosm and macrocosm. Everything signifies on multiple levels at once. And you need to think of the poem that way. This is the last poem. It's the 164th poem. It is, as the title would suggest, the third time he talks about love. So far as I can see, there is very little thematic resonance with the first two times, which are really more about sinfulness and the failure to act with charity in very specific ways in life. This is about the very end time. You'll remember, and Herbert certainly knew, that in Christianity there are four last things, right? There's judgment, there's death, there's heaven, there's hell. And the four poems that precede this one talk about those four things. So this is meant to be a kind of coda on last things. That's what it is. The reason I guess I think I would want to teach this in an introductory course are several, and I'm really fascinated here if all this makes any sense to you. So I'll talk for a few minutes and then just, I think, open it up rather than teach the poem per se, although I may do a little bit of that along the way. First, I think on one hand, this is a very accessible poem, and on the other hand, it's not at all accessible. It's in English that we can recognize, and yet there are some important semantic distinctions that come into play. There was a great conversation in the men's loo just now about the style of the New Yorker, and the style of George Herbert is really important here. So just to give a couple of examples of things that we need to think about is the juxtaposition of iambic pentameter lines with six-syllable lines. Very important in my judgment that throughout the first two stanzas, the speaker of the poem speaking to love is more polysyllabic, and love is almost resolutely monosyllabic throughout. The last stanza is all monosyllables except for the word deserve. So there are these ways in which we have to look at Herbert's language on that level. Semantically, quick-eyed love. The immediate reaction one has to that is a highly alert being. But of course, quickness is associated with death, the quick and the dead. The notion of quick-eyed at the time Herbert wrote had something to do with seeing into the eye of the other, seeing the quickness in the other as well as in oneself. The word yet in line 1 is a huge caesura moment. I don't think I quite rendered it so well. Love, baby, welcome, yet. Why would one not respond to that? To say yet is not to say but. It's to say stop. What happened here? The linkage, I think for Herbert, certainly, of eyes and I, which is common to us, is different for him because eyes always signals soul, and I is much more complicated than that. So the pun that we automatically see is a pun that's much more complicated for him, and the plural vis-a-vis the singular matters. And then, of course, these wonderful things at the end that gave me pause 35 or 40, now 40 years ago when I was in college. You must sit down and taste my meat. Meat doesn't mean anything other than the substance of divine forgiveness here. And it's meant to index Luke 12:37, but of course it doesn't just mean that, right? And so we have this interesting, complicated way in which the poem is very different from the expectations we bring to it. So one reason I think it would be interesting to talk about it is just this juxtaposition of what is, in some ways, and seems to be familiar, and yet is not. And this is the strange familiar theme, which I think we heard in both the first two presentations, I hope played out in a different way. The second reason I want to do it is I think it's a very interesting introduction to someone's notion of the experience of grace. And so often the discussion of grace is done on a dogmatic level. It's an exposition of experience, language, those kinds of things in propositional terms. Herbert doesn't do that here. He attempts to enact it, as it were, in the language. And I just think that's an interesting thing to think about. A third issue is the issue of what religious language is and whether religious language is poetic or not, whether it must be or not, is poetry religious, those kinds of things. And then fourthly, and kind of undergirding this, is I actually think this is a poem that is very amenable, but indeed, in the end, for us needs to have, working at once, three different kinds of readings. And so it's about what it means to read vis-a-vis religion. And the three readings in brief, I've alluded to the Freudian one, and I really don't mean in this context to limit it to the sexual. I joke about that at the start, that's real. But the uncanniness of this, the unexpectedness of this in certain ways, the surprise of it, I think that's very much part of the experience of this poem. It's obviously also a poem that can be read in terms of Anglican theology, right? And there the relevant terminology is, on the one hand, the great debates that are raging at this time between Anglicans and Puritans, particularly about the Eucharist and what goes on in the Eucharist, and whether intention is important to the communication of grace or not, applied both to the priest and also to the recipient. Matter and form, how do we conduct ourselves when he's... One of the big things that confuses religious scholars is, I did sit and eat. Because one of the big debates about communion is, do you kneel or do you sit? And Herbert is always thought to be a kind of a high church Anglican who would kneel, but he says, I did sit and eat. Now, we'll get to this again when we talk about the fact that this is about the last moment before heaven, but that's at play here. So you can read it as an Anglican piece. You can also read it deconstructively, because the word that's not in here, that one keeps expecting, is the word host. there's a kind of deferral of host, both in terms of the communion wafer, but also the host bringing you into heaven. A lot of language in Elizabethan theology about the divine host who will welcome you to heaven. And yet, the double entendre, and Herbert loves double entendres, is never employed here. And so one of the questions we want to ask is, why is something like that, to use the parlance, deferred? Why isn't it in the poem? So I'd be interested in trying to inculcate a way of bringing all these things together into play to think about this poem. And that's why I would use it. I think a couple of general points about it. One is, and I was really struck by this in both of the first two presentations, is just the whole issue of the relationship of transparency to religion. I think I would be really interested in teaching students to think about that in a way that is textured, which is to say that I resonate deeply with the impulse to introduce a critical sensibility, but I also think, and I don't know that this is in disagreement with anything that's been said, but I think we also need to think about the ways in which these texts are compelling. I'm probably still vestigially enough of a Colloquium to think that these texts make claims on people when they face them down, and that probably we need to recognize that. And I think this is a poem that acknowledges that in a way. Yet, on the other hand, I wouldn't restrict the reading to the Anglican theological at all. I wouldn't want to do that. And so I want to think about and find ways and as you know, as was indicated in both the earlier presentations, the debates within the Anglican world about this are raging, and they're very critical debates. So, this whole question of ex opere operato with the sacrament is very important here. And, you have someone like Richard Hooker, whom Herbert knew very well. It's interesting, this is a nuanced point. This gets into how much detail you get into. Herbert cares a lot less about the 39 articles than he does about Hooker. But Hooker basically says, well, this is how the sacrament works. And then at the end he says, unless it doesn't. and this is very interesting because Herbert's whole mentality throughout this is this mentality of affirmation and struggle. And so, finding a way to suggest that there's possibly at least it's at least plausible, not provable, that the insight of the deconstructionists of deferral of the host is related to something about deferral of the claim for sacrament, right? So there's interesting ways in which these begin to interact. The one that I can't integrate successfully, even though I think it's there, is the more sexual Freudian one. But I just can't quite make that work, even though I can't believe there's not something going on there, in effect. So I'm interested in transparency. I'm interested in the way these texts make kinds of claims. That's the second thing I would say. And then I think the last thing I would say is I like the idea of having something as simple as a single page that people can look at. I don't think that's the only way to do it, and it's not the only kind of thing I would do in something like this, but I like the idea of a contained piece of work that I think people can feel like in some sense they have some control over. Even though I would want to problematize that control, I think that's a good thing and a useful thing in effect. So those things are all things that informed the choice of it. The worries I have about it are several, and largely have been made in the earlier presentations and discussions quite well. I mean, one is the relationship between that accessibility that I want and the depth that you really need to unpack it, right? And how one does that well. Richard Hooker is no fun to read. I have a hard time imagining giving people a lot of the laws of ecclesiastical polity and expecting them to really get into it. I love the book, but I can't imagine it being terribly exciting to them. I also think that if I want to do the pre-readings thing, I have to introduce them to some theory of reading, and how to do that well is a good question in a context like this. But that said, it doesn't deter me from thinking it would be a fun thing to do and an interesting thing to do. So that's by way of introduction, and I would love to have some conversation and hear your feedback. Happy to take questions, but happier to have you all talking, John.
Yeah. Just a comment to begin. the thing that really strikes me is the introducing the idea of genre, and the fact that this is a poem, and I think to a lot of students, especially coming, early in undergrad, they may think, not to say you wouldn't think that poetry, there's hymns and there's psalms and things like that, but feels so different, and you've pointed to that, and the fact that a part of this can be about someone, struggles in terms of, in church history and these other aspects you've drawn out. And so I wonder how much you want to make that transparent in the conversation, and talk about the ways that we encounter religion in different genres. Or maybe that takes things in a different direction. I don't know. That's my first sort of reaction.
No, thanks. That's really great. So I have sort of three different reactions to that very nice question. One is that on one level, I don't want to talk about genre, but I do want to say to them, you got to breathe and you got to count. I would make them memorize the poem, I think, because I would want them to have to breathe it, and I would want them to have to count syllables, because I actually think Herbert does that a lot, and you get close to what's happening there if you have to recite the poem. I also think, by the way, that it gets into interesting ideas about knowing something by heart, and whether that's co-optative or not, and all that. And I think you could embody a certain kind of thing there. So in that sense, I think I would want to make genre pretty literal. That's point one. Second thing is, genre is really interesting here vis-a-vis this whole debate about Herbert being a metaphysical poet or not, right? And what does that mean? And this is an old idea. It actually wasn't inaugurated by T.S. Eliot, but he's the most famous expositor for it, that these are poets of ideas. And they're poets of yoking feeling and ideas in a kind of visceral way. And what drives it is a central conceit, that sort of thing. And so a way to go would be to talk about metaphysical poetry and the religious trappings of that. In that sense, we talk about genre, I think, too. And then the third is, I think, the really interesting question of whether you could teach an introduction to religion around genres, which is also a good question. And that's really interesting. I think that, I would say just two things about it, but I would really welcome other people's thoughts. One is, my own perspective from religion and literature is that we do that all the time without acknowledging it. That that's a kind of constant practice, actually. And the degree to which it's foregrounded or not is an interesting question. Probably a fairer way to put it is we do it all the time and we do acknowledge it, but the ways we acknowledge it are very different. Yeah?
My question, in a way, picks up to some extent from that, especially on the genre question in relation to what you said about Booker. That he wrote one page, for example, whatever you want to say. Now, what I'd like to know is, what do you think about the poet's voice, where the poet speaks from? Because it performs a game of an intimacy, this mean and love, which you could say is ultimately Protestant. There's nothing in the way.
Absolutely.
But it speaks as a priest, or he speaks as a priest. And now, if you put a priest in that equation, then you've got your Freudian problem, you've got Panda.
That's right.
Or you've got the person who will provide the meat.
Yes.
So there's a kind of, now then we've got a question about love. Is love God?
Yeah.
Or is actually love a priest's place in so one of these the poem defers to go back to is actually it performs something that can't be because it itself is the voice that enables the two sides of the equation, although spoken as me, so intimates. I don't know if I'm making sense. Anyway, so I just wonder about what you think about that. It seems to not say as much as it says, and in its not saying, to complicate or raise very significant, and in fact, it's kind of theological issues around kind of all the nexus of things. And it's absolutely, in a sense, that's a genre question.
Absolutely.
It is, yeah. No, I think that's right, and it's a great place where genre and theology coalesce exactly. I think everything you said is right, and they coalesce just around this question of voice, right? Because Herbert wants at one and the same time to be the respondent to love and the author of the poem. There's a fundamental ambiguity there, which I think you've named very well. But there's also an ambiguity in Herbert's time around the priesthood of all believers in relation to this, and this whole issue of whether holy orders licenses something that is not otherwise available. And the Puritans are on one end of the spectrum on this, and Archbishop Laud and the Book of Common Prayer people are on the other, right? And so there's a great way in which genre and priesthood are very nicely out there. Yeah, I think it's a great point. Yeah.
I'm interested in your idea that the students would memorize it, I guess because of the fact that it raises the issue, this relates to Yasha's point about the indexable quality of the pronoun.
Yeah.
The fact that each person then has to become that I.
Yeah.
And the fact that then the experience of reading it has to end with the completed seduction in some sense.
Yeah.
And so I guess I'm wondering if we're thinking about what it means to teach this in an intro to religion class. I mean, is this a way, can you think about this as a way to teach actually something beyond poetry, but also the sort of indexable quality of repeating prayer, I mean, and how the seduction functions. It strikes me that the sort of proximity between that act and the act of recitation would be a sort of neat way to think about how it might function in religion.
Yeah, I appreciate that, definitely. I totally agree with that, and I think, let me be very clear, I mean, I can tell a little story here that will illustrate the point well. So there's a famous story that when John Cormanson taught poetry at Kenyon College, there's a new critic, and the new critic's distrusted commentary, and he would read a poem, and he would say, "Are there any questions?" Someone would say, "Is that a caesura in line 8?" And he would reread the poem. Right? So I think one of the things you can't do if you do this in a class is you can't just recite the poem. You have to talk about recitation, you have to talk about the experience and just these issues. I think that's right. I also think I would want to say to the students, it's a performance, and there are ways to perform lines that are more and less in accord with a conventional reading. So I want all that to be in play, but I would also want to have in play this issue of this kind of seduction on multiple levels per what's in both your questions. Of Herbert is so easily made into this kind of nice poet. Oh, it's cute. Everything looks like wings and this and that. But he is, in fact, about very serious co-optation, and I think it's important to name that. So
what Sarah's just said is really about the empathetics of the study of religion. I mean, can you ever do it without empathy?
Yeah.
Can you ever do it with empathy?
Yeah.
And when?
Yeah.
Yeah, I just sort of following up on that. I really like what you said about using these texts to help students. Using texts that appreciate the way these texts are compelling and make claims on people. I think that's really important. And I have a feeling it's one of the things that lies underneath our instinct, if that's what I can call it, that we should begin with the sources, that we should work out of the sources. These are texts that have made demands on people, that have drawn people, texts and images and music and poetry and all sorts of all sorts of different kinds of genres, that they draw people, and they will draw the student, and they draw us, and that's a reason to begin here and allow the students to read this rather than to read somebody talking about this.
I think that. Oh, go ahead. No, go ahead, Karen. Well, I think that I agree with that. It matters to me that this is a text that is in tension with itself. I do teach it for that reason, but I also want to teach the tension in it. It's like the Jerry Graff thing about teach the conflicts with something like Huckleberry Finn, but driven down to the level of the sentence. But yes, you go ahead.
I really love this idea of memorizing, asking the student to memorize the poem. I think that, for one thing, it nicely complexifies the emetic aspect of religion, right? So you imagine yourself thinking these thoughts and saying them. And it's interesting enough for a Christian to do it with a Christian text, but to memorize and speak out a text of another religion, you hear yourself saying things, and you believe them, and what would it feel like if you were a person who did believe them? And I find that when I do a translation, the only way you can do a translation is to become the person you're translating. And when I translated the Laws of Manu, that was a real challenge, because he's a racist, sexist pig. And there I am, translating Manu, and I had to finally come to terms with him, and I said, he's so smart, and he's so erudite. I can get behind that, right? And there were ways that I had to imagine it was okay to think the thoughts that he thought. And that is a very useful religious exercise. And I think that memorizing reasonably short texts of another religion is a wonderful device that I have not used. And I will try to do so in the future. It never occurred to me how useful that would be. That's really interesting.
There are two hands down here and a hand over here. Go ahead.
I was wondering, along the lines of what Professor Doniger just raised about if this exercise would work in the same way. Well, obviously it wouldn't with something that's in translation, right?
Yeah.
So this is a great poem for this kind of exercise, and the English is very familiar but not familiar, and it really would lend itself to a native English speaker memorizing it and being able to kind of get into every syllable. But and these issues of recitation and talking about kind of the indicical quality, the pronouns, and how that changes if you're saying it. This is something I talk about with my students a lot when we're talking about the Quran, but my students don't know Arabic.
Yeah.
So is that useful then to have them memorize something short in translation or something short in a language that they don't know? I mean, people do that as well. How does that change this exercise?
Yeah, it's a really good question to which I do not have a good answer, except to say that I think it would be a problem if this was the only thing I gave them and the only thing they had to memorize. I think that would be bad. So if you commit to that, you probably commit to doing more of it. I think. I think it's a very good question. Go ahead.
I also want to address a question Professor Doniger's point she made in the last talk about using the word faith as a generic and ignoring its specifically Christian heritage. Do you think there's something similar going on here with grace? That to what extent does teaching this already depend on a familiarity not just with grace generally in Christianity, but with with the issues of grace in the English Reformation, particularly between Anglicans and Puritans, and if that, and how through that very specific purchase this poet is making as a Christian, as an Orthodox Christian, negotiating this particular thing, he has to, how to get through that specificity to something bigger about religion. Particularly if you have an intro class where one of the requirements is to teach more than just one particular tradition, at least two or maybe three.
Thank you, I agree. But I think the first thing I would want to do, and I would just have to use someone like Hooker here, is to get into the ritual theory of Anglican theology and form the matter and talk about that, and then broaden that out to look at other ritual traditions. I think the language of grace is like the language of faith. I probably am not as firmly convinced as the dean is about the problem of faith in relation to religion. I take the point about it, but I'm not as sure that it doesn't have some utility. That said, I would want to complicate. I don't want people to simply assume anything about grace other than the fact that it is regulative and normative for Herbert, right? That's important, and getting our heads inside that matters to me. But then I would want to look at, like I said, Hooker really complicates this theory of ritual. He says, here's how you do communion. These things have to happen, and intentions have to be good, and it always works, except when it doesn't. And when he says except when it does not, it's literally the last sentence in the section, and he doesn't itemize it. So that leaves you an opening, right, where you can say, well, now what's this all about? And then I think I would want to look at other kinds of ritual practices and look at the way they were articulated. I can imagine myself doing that with Judaism, but harder. I have to work at it. But I think it's very important.
So as somebody who's not taught an introduction to religion, I'm trying to imaginatively put myself in the position of introducing religion with this.
Okay.
And a worry arises in that context, and it's a worry in some sense that I don't have with the Avericus inscription, which is we have something that doesn't present itself, it seems to me, as a puzzle to undergraduates, especially undergraduates maybe the first time in a religion class, coming out of high school, as Kelly mentioned, where reaching this, again, imaginatively, I'm in a world of, okay, truth is beauty, beauty is truth. I kind of know this sort of thing.
That is all you know on earth, right. All you need to know, yeah.
And whereas and as you've done, I think very, very eloquently and compellingly for me, to make this into a puzzle means getting into these subtleties of Anglican history and theology, means invoking the lightning rods of eschatology and sacramentality, strikes me as throwing students into the deep end in order to draw them in. Whereas with something like the Vercus inscription, it presents itself immediately as a puzzle because now we have words that in another language. There's a breaking of the stone. There's a positioning in a museum with a reconstruction.
Right.
Here on the page, I'm looking for a hook that makes students who aren't yet interested in eschatology and the subtleties of when it is something that is not a sacrament. How do they get to that point from looking at this and seeing, well, I know how to do poetry because I went to high school.
Did you want to? Yeah,
can I offer? I was thinking about the same thing, and I actually posed a question to myself. How is this helpful? For me, it became a matter of where is this taking place? Because it starts with love, giving someone welcome, and ending with somebody sitting down. So it became a puzzle when I started thinking about the place. I mean, you mentioned the pearly gates, or entrance to heaven, or is it really? Does it say that? People actually, you actually build it. You go to the category of grace. It's a mention besides the word love. So I mean, and that's a puzzle. It became a puzzle. I thought I had to figure it out. I thought I had to figure it out when you read it. But then I looked at it and it's puzzling to me now. Like, I'm not really sure where I stand. So it's a way of approaching that.
Okay. Was that hand? Go ahead.
I was going to say, also asking one more person in a classroom, or asking two people, well, what do you think this means, or what's he referring to here, than asking someone else immediately. I think it's very likely if the students are engaged, it will become a puzzle. Because, sure, someone could say, I think what he thinks, but if one person offers an interpretation, it's likely that the next one is different, and the one after that is different. I think that's an easy way in to say, okay, so we're not fully agreed about what this means, and you expand from there. And I think just knowing that you don't think what your neighbor thinks means that something isn't obvious, or there's some kind of confusion. And that, I mean, to me, that's the sort of, engaged, active part of a student thinking through without having to provide any context. And then as you start to add and layer, it becomes extremely puzzling, I think, which is in some ways more seductive than something that seems complicated immediately because you think, oh, I thought I knew what this was and now I don't.
No, go ahead.
Well, I'm on the same feeling in that I've found that undergraduates and also some graduate students that come to the study of religion often with a mental line in their head of what's secular and what's religious. And it's often unreflective, it's unargued, but it's, I can give you examples from, while you can't put the Roman emperors into Revelation 17 because Revelation 17 is a religious text, not a political text. An undergraduate said to me. Really? I think he didn't want to memorize the reign years. And so what I love about this is that it really does raise all kinds of questions about where the religion is and what the canons are and what is a canon and where can back to Hector, that not only where is it in the poem, but where does this poem belong? Like who ought to read this and why? And so I want to ask you, if I'm your undergraduate student who says to you in an unrecognized Boltzmannian mood, can't I just demythologize this? And it's a beautiful love poem. It's a poem of love and encounter. And this is going to be on my Valentine this year. If you say that to your undergrad student, you'll get in trouble. But in essence, that someone could say, you don't need, maybe back then they had this eschatological thing, but none of us believe that anymore. but I still like it. I want to put it up on my refrigerator. I want to, whatever. And so, like, how would you say, as a new critic, you can do that? Or would you say, actually, this is about religion?
So there's one quote at the beginning of the third stanza. Lord, truth Lord, and then the key transformative, the grace moment, in fact, which is when it turns out that my shame is, in fact, the act.
Right.
So, now that, of course, you could put that in first, but there is something else.
Yeah.
I mean,
Lord is just an exclamation.
Well, first of all, I wouldn't answer it as a new critic, of course, because a new critic can't really answer that question without becoming something else. But I think what I would say is, yeah, it is a love poem. It is Valentine, absolutely, and that's part of what's at play here. I don't think there's any question of that. So this gets back to the three kinds of readings, right? And this is where for me at least, the combination of the deferral of hosts, which I really think is incredible. I mean, I just think that's just amazing to me. And this kind of double entendre sexuality is very real to Herbert. I don't think it's not there. And so, yeah, you can read it as a love poem. It is a love poem. It is also a poem of someone who is about to enter heaven, or is hoping to enter heaven. And those things are for Herbert poeticized together. Analogously, I would say, Herbert poeticizes the water that comes out of the side of the crucified Lord as the blood that will sanctify us, right? So, these are transferable images in various ways. There's no question. Yeah.
Just relating to my poem about adultery and the whole use of sexual metaphor in religion throughout the world, the Song of Solomon. It's not an either-or thing, right? You can read it that way if you like. Yeah. To say that is all it is means you've missed the history of the poem. But to say that it's there, sure it's there.
Maybe. Well,
there's a change. Go ahead.
Well, just really quickly. Maybe I could gloss slightly what I said earlier about faith in this respect. It's not so much that I want to make faith at all an autonomy for religion as that I want to insist in some way on style as a category for religion. That might be a way to put it. And that there's a style here. And that just like the New Yorker has a style, or, religions have styles. And Herbert has a religious style. And there are far worse ways to figure out religiosity than faith and style.
Basic pedagogical question. In teaching this, how much do you tell them ahead of time? Do you say this is by a 16th century? Or do you have them see it for the first time in class and read it and let them make of it whatever the heck they... I mean, presumably it's in a religion class of some situation.
I would heard Josh's comment, I would put the word Lord in italics. That's a really good question. I think I would want to get it to him blind myself. Because I think per Kelly's comments or Aaron's comment earlier that unpacking what's here would be more effective than telling ahead of time. That's my instinct, but I'm interested in what other people. I mean, do you have an opinion on it?
It seems like it would elicit a wider range of reactions if you didn't tell them anything.
Yeah, that's kind of what I
usually want.
Yeah, that's my instinct anyway. I just think that would be useful. Because, one of the things that seems to be very much in the air of our discussion today that I like, just to be clear that I am genuinely vestigially Tillichian, because I think Wendy grew up a few gray hairs when I said that, is just that I do like the notion of the kind of strangeness, familiarity dynamic in all this. I do think myself that introductory pedagogy has to be somewhat continually attentive to that. That there are ways in which people, we could say they're compelled by these texts, but another way to put it, which is I think more the parlance of our previous discussions, is they think they know these texts, right? And some combination of that set of things. I mean, one of the things this poem is about is the presumption of knowledge. as it's related to familiarity, right? And so I think we have to acknowledge those things and then figure out to what degree do we play on them and to what degree do we just let them play out. And I confess that that's one of the least easy things about this for me, right? Is that I am not interested in controlling people's initial reactions to material, just in general. I'm not. I don't think that's a good idea. There are problems with that, right? But my instinct is the first, and this is where sources matter, the first thing is, okay, look at this, what do you see? What do you make of this? And then we can talk about it. But I really prefer that to saying, oh, this is about X and Y and Z. So my instinct always is, here it is, take a look at it, and then we'll talk about it. But I will say that, I've taught a version of this intro class before, and I always put theory texts in tandem with primary texts, and I don't think I'm going to do that when I teach it next year, but it does deracinate things in some ways that make it easy.
Can you imagine dialogical reading of it?
Oh, absolutely, it's a dialogue, absolutely.
Yeah, so
absolutely.
Antiphonally.
Yeah. Well, the other way I thought about performing it in class, I like the idea of them memorizing it because I think they get at Herbert. But the other way I thought about doing this with you guys is to go around the room and have them go ahead and read moments, which so that you enhance the back and forth of it. Yeah, absolutely. It's a dialogue, and that's another thing.
And could you mentioned, but you didn't exegete, why is deserve the only two-syllabic word in last stanza?
I see, yeah. Because the whole pivot of the poem is whether he merits salvation. And at this point, his capacity to deny love's entreaties, or I think it's him, is diminishing fast. And he can only muster up one polysyllabic word, but it's the polysyllabic word that has to do with merit. So it's the last vestige of his doubt. And notice how declarative love gets. You must sit down and taste my meat. And then what does he do? For the first time in the poem, he gets his prosody just like love. So I did sit and eat. We're out of Dodge. Well, we're into heaven. That's better, isn't it? This is not Wyatt Earp. Whatever it is. Yeah, I'm not into heaven. It doesn't work very well. That's the other problem. Yeah, that's right. I have to rein in my metaphors.
I sort of wonder what the effect of teaching this poem along with Wendy's love poems would be.
Oh, that'd be fun.
That would bring out the different.
That'd be very interesting.
Different contexts. Teaching one after the other. That would be a way of not.
Can I just raise one question?
One last question.
I guess the one thing I keep thinking about today is the fact that in the intro-religion class, these texts, the students come with the expectation that there's also a concept they relate to, which is why I was thinking about what the function of recitation is. But I just wonder, how do you move between the sort of method of beginning with sources and the sort of the expectation that in your religion, if there aren't traditions, there are at least concepts, right? And I guess I was curious as to what, if you had to address that via the poem, how would you address it?
That's a good question. I don't know. Good question. For sure. I guess I can talk about. Well, that's not going to happen. I guess that the way I have done it in the past, for example, is to read Luther and then read someone like Rudolf Otto or something like that, which I don't actually like because it straitjackets Luther, and that's not good. But I think it's a really good point. Part of what I was trying to get at when I invoked context is certain kinds of concepts about how context creates framing. But that doesn't really answer the question. It's a good question. Maybe genre helps there, too. Certainly reading has conceptual assumptions in it, but I think that has to be lifted up more. That's a good question. Sorry, I don't know better.
Okay, we have a break. Thank you very much. First, we have a break for lunch. There is plenty of lunch over there for everybody in this room, and we reconvene at 1:30.
1:30.
We thank you for listening to or viewing our podcast. For more information and for other podcasts, please see our website, divinity.uchicago.edu/podcasts. Copyright, the University of Chicago Divinity School.